This week, the ongoing impeachment inquiry into President Donald Trump is gripping the nation, and somehow there are Jews just everywhere in this story. We unpack what's going on, refocus our Israel news from political chaos to a Russian hostage, and take a moment to reflect on a harrowing moment on Yom Kippur in Germany. I'm Lev Gringaus, and welcome to The Jews Are Tired, your podcast about Jewish news. So let's start with impeachment. I know possibly the least fun topic on earth, but one that, strangely enough, highlights some of the unique challenges of being a Jew. First, the background. Earlier this year, on July 25th, Trump had a phone call with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, and according to an inexact transcript of the call released by the White House, whistleblower testimony from inside Trump's administration, as well as officials who listened in on the call and spoke to the press, Trump pressured Zelensky to open two investigations, one into Joe Biden's son for corruption when involved with the Ukrainian company some years ago, and another into a conspiracy theory repeated by right-wing American media that claims Ukraine wrongly blamed Russia for election interference in 2016. Biden, as I'm sure you know, is running for president in the 2020 elections, and by virtue of that is Trump's political rival. Now, about a week before this call, Trump suspended almost $400 million in U.S. assistance to Ukraine. It's important to note that Ukraine has been locked in a ground and cyber war with Russia since 2014, when Russia invaded and annexed Crimea illegally in the far east of Ukraine. Russia's war with Ukraine has displaced about 1.5 million people, according to the UN, killed thousands, and has also trashed the economy. This is all another way of saying that it's no small thing that Trump suspended $400 million in U.S. assistance and then pressured the newly elected Ukrainian president to open sham investigations aimed at political opponents. In a nutshell, this is why Democratic members of Congress have launched an impeachment inquiry. But to provide another perspective on this, looking as we are through the lens of Jewish news, I just want to bring the picture here into even clearer focus, because as with everything in our extra polarized times, there's a lot of mudslinging and back and forth on whether what Trump said and did was wrong and impeachable. If you want to hear the secular news version of that conversation, 100% go check that out. But here, I just want to zoom in and explain to you why this is personal. I spent about 2 months in the spring of 2018 traveling all around Ukraine, where my mother happens to be from, and in that time I spoke to all kinds of Ukrainian Jews and really got a crash course on the situation there. Remember that 1.5 million people displaced because of the Russia-Ukraine war? Well, a whole lot of them are Jews. And Ukrainian Jews are just like American Jews in that they are seriously patriotic for their country, and their country is not doing so hot. There is political corruption, economic struggles, and an ongoing war with the global superpower. So when American aid is being withheld for the personal whims of a president who wants dirt on his opponents, as an American I see corruption, but as a Jew, I'm enraged that my people in Ukraine are being used as bargaining chips because they need that aid. So, zooming out again, I'm setting that aside. There are a number of notable Jews involved more directly in this mess. First of all, Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, is Jewish. Adam Schiff, the Democratic congressman currently spearheading the impeachment inquiry, is Jewish. Mark Zaid, one of the national security lawyers representing the whistleblowers, is Jewish. And so are two recently arrested associates of Rudy Giuliani, Trump's personal attorney who has played a huge part in pressuring Ukraine. Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman, yes, these are real names and not James Bond supervillains, were arrested last week on charges of funneling Russian money into American politics, which is a violation of campaign finance law. Parnas and Fruman are Soviet-born Florida businessmen who became major Republican donors over the past few years and were helping Giuliani and Trump carve their way into Ukraine. So, to wrap up this story for now, while the impeachment inquiry isn't anywhere near over yet, I think we have to keep an eye out for what's going on and for the Jews involved. The way I see it, there are two reasons for this. Number one, the frustrating reason, which is that even if we Jews ignore who is and isn't Jewish in this story, Anti-Semites don't. I can't help but see this as eventually feeding into all of the conflicting things Jews are the boogeyman for. We're accused of being socialists, communists, and globalists by right-wingers because there have been prominent Jewish socialists, and we're accused of being capitalists and part of the oppressive elite by left-wingers because there have been prominent Jewish capitalists. So keeping an eye out for how the impeachment story could factor into these pre-existing sentiments, I think is necessary, because at some point the Jews will always get blamed. And number two, the more internal reason. I think holding onto Jewish complexity is important. I've got family members who were merchants at the time of the Russian Empire, and I've got family members who were Bolsheviks and part of the revolution against the merchant class. And here we are now on all sides of impeachment. I don't always know how to articulate this, but in a world of fake news and distrust of facts and black and white perspectives, I find that an understanding of the complexity of Jewish life helps ground me and helps me navigate the news, which is always more complex than it seems. And I can only hope that this perspective helps you too. Now, let's go to our second story this week, this time Israel-related, but not to do with election politics. Earlier this year, in April, 26-year-old Naama Issachar was on her way back to Israel from a trip in India when she was arrested during a layover at the airport in Moscow, Russia. Issachar had about 9.5 grams of marijuana found in her bag and was thrown in jail where she has been for months. Last week, she was sentenced by Russian authorities to 7.5 years in prison. This is, ostensibly, the punishment for 9.5 grams or 0.33 ounces of weed. Only this has nothing to do with drugs. It's a hostage negotiation. Back in 2015, Israel detained a Russian hacker wanted by the United States for cyber fraud. This hacker still hasn't been sent back to the US to stand trial, even though it's been in the works for that to happen. Russia, for some reason, wants this Russian hacker out of U.S. hands, and speculation is that this guy has something to do with Russian intelligence work, though, of course, he denies that. So, Russia decided to play how Russia always plays, with brute bullying force. They arrested Issachar and are trying to swap for the hacker. Now, Israel doesn't have a lot of wiggle room. The hacker is already set to go to America, and Israel's legal system can't undo the final stamp on that. Not to mention, undercutting America is never a good move. So Russia's power play doesn't look like it'll go anywhere, but for now, Issachar is still trapped there with no end in sight. I'll keep my other anti-Russian sentiments to myself, but I'll bring you an update on this story when there is one, but for now, let's move on to our last story. On Yom Kippur, just last week, a 27-year-old German neo-Nazi tried to storm a synagogue in the city of Halle where over 50 people were gathered for services. Miraculously, the doors of the synagogue kept the attacker out, even as he tried to blow it up with explosives and shoot at it with homemade weapons. Unable to kill any Jews, he killed 2 non-Jewish bystanders instead, and a few hours later, he was in police custody. In the aftermath of this almost massacre, a couple of notable things have come up. In terms of the neo-Nazi, he denies being a neo-Nazi and insisted he's only Jew-critical, despite having a whole manifesto blaming the Jews for everything wrong in the world. I'm just going to say now that claim does not hold up. With the manifesto, style of attempted attack, and live streaming his actions onto the gaming site Twitch, this terrorist is also copying the perpetrators of the mosque attacks in Christchurch and the Poway synagogue shooting from earlier this year. This German neo-Nazi was also anonymously paid around $800 in the cryptocurrency Bitcoin, which all serves as evidence for what experts like the Anti-Defamation League say is a global network of neo-Nazi and white supremacist ideology that inspires attacks like these. But in the context of Europe, strangely enough, this guy is also an anomaly, as pointed out by the Jewish telegraphic agency's Europe reporter Kanan Lifshitz in a recent article. Most terror attacks on Jews in Europe over the past few decades have been from extremist or far-left Muslims and not the far-right, which leaves many European Jews ever more conscious of being stuck between a rock and a hard place when dealing with the spectrum of anti-Semitism. Sounds a little bit like how it feels to be a Jew in America right now, yeah? So, this week, I want to leave you on this perhaps strange takeaway, and it's this: we are not alone. It's easy to get caught up in how difficult it is to be a Jew in America nowadays, stuck between left and right and barricading ourselves into our synagogues while trying to maintain our dignity and an atmosphere of welcome. It is not easy. And again, here I can only share my personal experience, but what is our extended Jewish family for if not supporting one another and finding faith in one another? Jews in Europe have many of the same challenges we do. But watching the variety of proud and strong European Jewish leaders, particularly young Jewish leaders, take a stand after the near massacre on Yom Kippur to hold governments and communities accountable to fight anti-Semitism and racism, holding on to their values and their dignity while navigating today's craziness, just that feeling of being less alone and connected to our people, for me, it makes everything else just a little bit more bearable. So, as we are now in the harvest holiday of Sukkot, when we are commanded to be happy and full of joy, I think we can still find that feeling, hard though it is. So, on that note, Chag Sukkot Sameach, wishing you a happy Sukkot, even in the midst of all we're going through. This has been this week's The Jews Are Tired podcast. I'm Lev Gringaus, and hopefully next week, the Jews will get some rest. The Jews Are Tired is a product of Jewfolk Inc. For more information, go to tcjewfolk.com or email the show at podcast@tcjewfolk.com.